Okay, so I might want to make a couple of announcements today. That be sure to remember Monday's a holiday, and if you show up here, I won't be here. So I'll see you on Wednesday after this lecture. And also, a few people have asked about the exams in this part of the course, and noted that I had a lot more to say during the lecture than are on the slides. And I do that so I give you a little more context and appreciation for the material. But it's really what's both on the slides. I mean, what's on the slides is what I'm trying to make sure everybody picks up on. And the additional things I have to say in the lecture are just to try to increase your learning, to increase the potential to learn the material and to appreciate the material. So you shouldn't have to take notes in the lecture to the extent that you're copying down everything I have to say. I mean, if you really want to do that, remember that these are also webcast lectures. You can go back and do that. But it'd be great if you could really try to focus on the material rather than just quickly write down everything. I mean, if that's the way you best learn things, then go ahead, but it's not really necessary. Are there questions about that? Okay, so today we're going to go on and with the gymnosperms, we're going to really be focused on seed plants the rest of the semester. And this will be really the last lecture that has to do with gymnosperms. And then we'll be looking at flowering plants for the rest of the semester. And they're the vast diversity of land plants in general, so and most economically and ecologically important. So there's good reasons for that. So last time I left off with this slide and introduced two of the major groups of gymnosperms, two of the four phyla, the cycads, which are these superficially palm-like subtropical to tropical plants, some of which have very large cones. And then I talked about ginkgo briefly, which is both of these groups being much more diverse in the past than they are today. And I just started to mention the neophytes, which are a group of about 75 species, mostly in drier habitats, although there's one genus not shown here that's a vine of tropical forest, wet tropical forest. And I mentioned ephedrine being a stimulant produced by ephedra, which is a common plant in the deserts of North America and other parts of the world. And I briefly mentioned Welwitschia, this platypus of the plant kingdom, according to Darwin, that is bizarre, like a platypus, in the sense that it only produces 2 foliage leaves in its entire life. And this looks like more leaves here, but these are actually just shredded. They continue to grow in width and length indefinitely through the life of the plant. It grows out on the Namibian desert floor, Southwest Africa. It looks like a stranded octopus out there in these incredibly dry desert habitats. It's hard to sort of give you a great feeling for this clade. It's not very well diagnosed as far as obvious morphological features, but there are some unusual features of reproduction. For example, the opening in the ovule through which pollination occurs is long and tubular. That's very hard to see. They're obscure features, but it's pretty clear that this is a natural group. And the reason I even talk about it is because you're unlikely to notice these plants in the wild, but this is the group that was thought to be the closest living relatives of the flowering plants. And when I was first teaching here at Cal, this was essentially the dogma that the neophytes and the flowering plants were sister groups. And by understanding the neophytes, we can understand the flowering plant origins, et cetera. Turns out to be a complete fallacy. It's not true at all. The neophytes are most closely related instead to this group, the most spectacular and diverse of modern conifers, modern gymnosperms, the conifers. And this is a group that you're all probably familiar with, no doubt, very conspicuous at high latitudes and high elevations. And we even have some lower elevation taxa that are really prominent, like the coast redwood. The wonderful odors of these plants are volatile hydrocarbons that are important in their defense against herbivores. And in fact, the tissues of these plants are so well protected by terpenes and other secondary compounds that they can achieve great ages and also great sizes because they're pretty vulnerable to attack by microbes and herbivores, invulnerable to those attacks. And of course, these are some of our most important timber trees as well, because of the fact that they do get to be quite large. And their wood is also relatively uniform compared to a lot of flowering plants. We'll talk about that later. But some of these plants, like the giant sequoia, which is the largest organisms on Earth, I mean, these things get up to about 2,500 tons. That's about the size of 2 dozen blue whales, which are the largest animals that we know that have ever lived, and are endemic here in California on the west slope of the Sierra Nevada at mid elevations, but were once much more widespread in the past. Same goes for the coast redwood. Huge trees, not as massive as the Sierra big trees, but the tallest trees on Earth. They get over 300 feet tall and reach from about Monterey County in central California up to southwestern Oregon. So endemic to the California forested province, at least, if not the state of California. And again, they essentially don't die of natural causes other than falling over or being burned to death in fires. They're really resistant to diseases. And the same goes for the oldest known trees on Earth, which are also found here in California, the bristlecone pine, which is up at subalpine elevation in these desert ranges east of the Sierra Nevada and into the Great Basin. And some of these getting up to over 5,000 years old. So some really ancient trees growing on very poor soils, dolomite soils, grow very slowly, but they live very long. And this is a plant that is somewhat, there's a story I'll just tell briefly. The oldest one that was ever actually documented was documented as being the oldest because the forester that was trying to core it and figure out how old it was got frustrated, and he finally got a chainsaw and cut it down. And they counted the rings and realized that it was much older than any other tree that had ever been recorded before. And he did report that, but to his own downfall, because once people found out he sawed it down, he became pretty much a pariah. That's in modern-day Great Basin National Park in eastern Nevada. So these plants get into some of these desert ranges. So conifers have some features that really are great for drought resistance. They can't withstand having their tissues dry out, but they have thick cuticle waxy covering on their leaves, which are typically needle-shaped, as you're probably aware, or scale-shaped. So they have some really nice features to avoid drought stress. And they are not particularly common. In fact, they're not a significant part of the flora in lowland tropical areas of the world where angiosperms are most diverse, flowering plants are most diverse. But up at higher latitudes, higher altitudes, when there's a lot of cold or drought stress, they can be the dominant plants. And you're no doubt aware about that. So these are really important organisms. And we're going to focus on conifers as an example of the life cycle of gymnosperms in general here. But first, I want to point out some important changes from the fern life cycle that I just showed you. And that is that, starting out, let's look at the land plants overall. A moss sporophyte is shown here. Here we have a fern sporophyte. And here's a Angiosperm, a conifer sporophyte. And so clearly we have an increase in dominance and size of the sporophyte, going from here where the diploid or sporophyte generation was parasitic on the gametophyte generation to being the dominant generation in pteridophytes, but still not being huge plants for the most part. And finally, we get into the seed plants, and we have huge sporophytes. And at the same time, we have reduction of the gametophyte generation, where it's the dominant generation in the bryophytes like mosses. It's definitely not the dominant generation in the vascular plants, but it's still a macroscopic, fairly large, but free-living organism in the ferns. But we get into the seed plants, and it's a whole different story. The gametophytes become highly reduced. They're highly sheltered from the environment and protected from the environment in the seed plants. And we're going to look at that in more detail in a moment here. So here are some Angiosperm gametophytes. And this is in pine. So on the left here is the male gametophyte at maturity. So the male gametophyte, remember, we're talking now with seed plants about all seed plants are heterosporous. They have two different types of spores, microspores and megaspores. They produce in different sporangia on the same sporophyte. And in the microsporangia, we have microspores produced by meiosis that germinate to become male gametophytes, which are the pollen. So pollen is a male gametophyte. And at maturity, at the time the pollen is shed from the plant, it's an immature male gametophyte. But when it reaches receptive tissue and grows the pollen tube down toward the egg to fertilize the egg with the sperm that are inside of it here, then it's a mature male gametophyte. You can see it only consists of a small number of cells. It's an extremely reduced organism, but it is an organism. This is every bit as much a plant as a pine tree is. It's just the haploid generation. It's not the diploid generation. And you can see that sometimes there are wings here, not always, but sometimes there are structures that help the pollen be transported. In conifers, it's wind pollination. Pollination is the act of moving the pollen from the plant that produced it to the receptive surface where the pollen tube will grow. And in any case, this is all there is to the male gametophyte. It's protected by the resistant outer wall of the pollen grain while it's in its immature state. And by the time it's actually germinating and growing here, it's inside the ovule in the case of a conifer or a Angiosperm in general, so it's protected by the ovule to some extent. And it's actually parasitic on the tissues of the ovule as it grows down toward the egg. So this is a highly reduced organism that's really pretty well protected. And the female gametophyte then is produced again from a megaspore that germinates inside the megasporangium. So this is a strange thing. We actually have germination of a spore inside of the sporangium that produced it. That's what's going on in seed plants, all of them. The megaspore germinates inside the megasporangium, and it becomes the female gametophyte. And so remember, the megasporangium in seed plants is enclosed within tissue called integument. And that's a tissue of uncertain homology, but it may represent bracts that fused around the megasporangium back in deep evolutionary time. We don't have any nice fossil evidence to demonstrate that. But the female gametophyte then lives its entire life inside the ovule. And the ovule, remember, at its original early stages is just a megasporangium surrounded by one or two layers of integument. And the integument becomes the seed coat that protects the contents of the seed, which in Angiosperms includes mostly female gametophyte tissue. So this, if you've had pine nuts before, the tissue you're eating is mostly female gametophyte. And embedded within that female gametophyte is a diploid embryo, its progeny, that will go on to become, in this case, a pine tree. So that's the situation. The female gametophyte tissue then will nourish the young sporophyte, its progeny, as it develops to the stage of being an embryo, and then the seed will dry out. It'll become desiccated, and at the time of its dispersal. And eventually, when it germinates, it hydrates and germinates. The embryo, the diploid embryo, will feed off of this haploid female gametophyte tissue until it establishes a root system and gets some foliage leaves out and can take off on its own. And then that's the end of the female gametophyte. All right, so let's look at this in more detail now in terms of the life cycle of pines. You're probably all familiar with pine cones. And when we think of a pine cone, we think of something like this. But that's just the seed cone. Conifers produce two different types of cones. One type of cone that gives rise to seeds and one type of cone that gives rise to pollen. So the microsporangia are inside the pollen cones and the megasporangia are inside the seed cones. And these seed cones take over 2 years from the time they're first initiated until they're releasing seeds. So on a given pine tree, you can find stages like this in the early development of a seed cone and later stages like this. Oftentimes the seed cones will persist even after they release the seeds. You might see 3 different seasons of seed cone development on a given tree at a single time. The pollen cones are more ephemeral, and they're a lot smaller than the seed cones. They're not woody. They don't have woody scales like these. Pollen cones actually have scales that are homologous to leaves, whereas the scales on a seed cone are homologous to a branch off of a stem. We're not going to go into that much, but it's a major distinction in conifers between pollen cones and seed cones. And usually we have both pollen cones and seed cones born on the same tree. There are conifer species that produce seed cones only on a particular individual, pollen cones only on another individual, but that's relatively unusual in northern hemisphere conifers. All right, so we're going to now focus on this alternation of generations that we see within conifers. This is our first seed plant example of a sexual life cycle. Everything that's haploid is in yellow here. And I should say not everything shown here is haploid because there's some tissue that had to be included that was diploid, but the things that they're focused on are haploid, and the things focused on here are diploid. So here we have our diploid sporophyte, the pine tree producing both pollen cones and seed cones. And here's one scale from a pollen cone, one scale from a seed cone up here. And if we look at the underside of the pollen cone scale, one of these appendages off of the cone, if you look underneath, you can see a microsporangium attached there. And inside that microsporangium, like in all sporangia of land plants, we have meiosis occurring to give rise to microspores that germinate to become male gametophytes, which all microspores do. And the male gametophyte is a pollen grain in its immature stage, as I just showed you. And then wind will transport it, if it's lucky, to the open end of an ovule. So pollination in Angiosperms is the movement of pollen to the ovule itself and to the pollination chamber of the ovule, which is inside the open end of the ovule. When you think of a seed, it's completely closed up. The seed coat is tight around it, but in its early development, it's actually open at one end, and that's what we call the micropyle end. Anyways, that's the act of pollination. The pollen has to actually enter the ovule itself, the immature seed in a conifer and other Angiosperms. So here's an ovule in its early stages of development, actually right here. So the ovule is born on one of the cone scales of the seed cone. And again, the ovule is just the megasporangium surrounded by one layer of integument in a gymnosperm. And that integument, remember, becomes the seed coat later. So that's the most immature stage of an ovule. Now, one of the different things about seed plants from what we saw in free-sporing vascular plants, this is the megasporangium. Yeah, in free-sporing vascular plants that are heterosporous, we get multiple functional megaspores produced by meiosis, usually 4, sometimes more. But in the case of meiosis in the megasporangium of a seed plant, there's still going to be 4 products of meiosis. Only one cell undergoes meiosis inside the megasporangium, giving us 4 products of meiosis, haploid products. And only one of those spores actually is viable. The other 3 disintegrate. And that one spore then, that one megaspore, will germinate and through mitotic divisions and further development becomes the female gametophyte. So an ovule, remember the female gametophyte develops and lives its entire life inside the ovule. There's room in there for one female gametophyte. So really you couldn't have multiple megaspores giving rise to female gametophytes. That's not the way it works. And the female gametophyte then is a multicellular organism, just like the pollen at maturity, but it has a lot more cellular content. And it even has archegonia that it produces. It actually has gametangia that look like somewhat like those of ferns and bryophytes. It's a jacket of sterile cells basically around an egg at the base. The antheridium has been lost altogether in seed plants. So pollen doesn't have an antheridium. It produces sperm, but there's no jacket of sterile cells around the cells that give rise to the sperm. It's more highly reduced. But in gymnosperms, well, at least in the conifers and the gymnosperms, and in most gymnosperms, we have true archegonia that form near the open end of the ovule. And that's where the pollen enters. The pollen tube grows down and grows down the neck of the archegonium and fertilizes the egg. So here we have fertilization now. And you can see 2 zygotes here. So there are 2 archegonia in pine gametophytes typically. And you can have more than one pollen tube from different pollen grains growing down and fertilizing different zygotes. But usually only one of those zygotes actually survives and ends up developing into an embryo, diploid embryo here, which is thrust into the center of this gametophyte tissue. And the female gametophyte tissue then serves as the nutritive tissue for the developing embryo throughout its development until, as I mentioned, gets to a point where it becomes dormant. And we have desiccation of the contents of the seed. In seed plants, the only desiccation-tolerant stage is the embryo stage. Remember, in ferns and some lycophytes, they can dry out and rehydrate and refine, but this is the only real desiccation-tolerant stage in seed plants. And also then the integuments harden. They become a seed coat, protective surface around the embryo and the female gametophyte tissue that remains to nourish it. The seeds are sometimes winged or have appendages that promote dispersal. And this entire unit, including the embryo, the female gametophyte, what's left of it, the very remnants of the megasporangium that included that female gametophyte, and the integument, all of that gets dispersed. So we're not talking about dispersal of a spore. We're talking about dispersal of the remains of the entire sporangium, the megasporangium, plus the female gametophyte, plus the embryo. So 3 generations of tissue are all dispersed together here. And then this can remain in a viable state until conditions are right for germination. And then it'll rehydrate, and we end up with nourishment of the embryo by the female gametophyte tissue until it can get established and become a new sporophyte. So there's a lot of sheltering by the environment here. Are there questions about this before we go on? Just to make a few, yeah. Yeah, so the 3 generations of tissue here, we have the seed coat, which was produced by the pine tree that produced the seed cone and the ovules. We have the female gametophyte inside, which is a haploid organism, which was the progeny of this sporophyte. And then we have the embryo, a diploid organism, which will eventually become something like this. That's the progeny of that female gametophyte. So we have diploid, haploid, diploid as we go from the outside to the inside or the inside to the outside. So that's pretty different. And that's a lot of sheltering of a whole generation there, the female gametophyte generation and the early sporophyte generation as far as the embryo goes. So here we have we have 3 different stages, just to reiterate. So both the male and female pine gametophytes, that is the pollen and the gametophyte inside the ovule, are each sheltered from the environment to some extent. Although the male gametophyte, the pollen, is going to have to be shed from the microsporangium in order for it to reach the ovule. And so it actually does get exposed to the environment, but during that time it's protected by this highly resistant wall around the pollen grain. And in conifers, at least, that transport of the pollen grain is by wind. Remembering, in those palm-like cycads that I mentioned, there is insect pollination there. Beetles and a primitive group of bees are involved in their pollination, but most gymnosperms have wind pollination. So freestanding water now has been removed as a necessary feature for completion of the life cycle. There's no more free-swimming sperm. Sperm are delivered directly to the ovule. And in the case of gymnosperms, sperm are delivered by a pollen tube directly to the egg. I didn't mention it, but in cycads and ginkgo, there actually is, the sperm does have flagellae, but it's basically delivered still to the ovule, and it has just a very short distance to go within the ovule. It doesn't have to swim through the environment. So the ovule, or the seed, these different stages, protect and nourish the entire female gametophyte generation and the subsequent sporophyte generation during its early development, that is the sporophyte generation as an embryo and even as an early seedling. And this happens even after it's shed from the plant that originally produced the ovule. Okay, so those are some really major advances and probably responsible for the ability of seed plants, in large part, to be able to be so successful in some of the harsher environments, terrestrial environments,